Good morning, APUSH. Happy Wednesday. Yesterday we went over Nixon's foreign policies, and today we are going to be looking more closely at his domestic ideas. As a recap, in the 1960s, we see a large opposition of the general public towards the traditional ideas that were forced upon them in the 1950s. We see this development of counterculture. People are rebelling against their traditional gender roles, what was expected of them in terms of their sexual orientation. African Americans start fighting against this idea of segregation in a more vocal and more militant way as a way to assert their equal rights. And all of this is important to understand the 1970s because it makes some of this regression that we see in the 1970s, especially under Nixon, it puts a lot of it into correct context. So today we are going to be looking at his domestic policies. Let me go and share my screen so we can look at our slideshow at the beginning. So as I said, we're going to be looking at Nixon's domestic policy today. Before we get started, take 30 seconds. Make sure you have some paper out to take notes. You have a pen or pencil out, as well as your classwork file. I'm gonna let you guys know in on a secret. I have you guys watch these videos on YouTube. Every day I can look at the analytics of my video and see exactly how long people are watching the video. For example, last week, one of the most important videos that I put out, the average was about a 25% watch rate. And that's just not okay. So make sure when you are watching these videos, you have the first 20 minutes to do this. This is gonna give you all of the context. So whenever you hop on Zoom, my first question will be, have you watched the video in its entirety? If the answer is no, then you need to get off of Zoom and join that video and watch that. You also need to make sure you are watching the video because it's going to give you a sneak preview into your oral drill quiz for the day that counts towards your participation credit to make sure that you are prepared to answer those quiz questions as best that you can. Okay, now that we've reset those norms, let's go ahead and transition into our lecture for the day. Move my little screen up here. Great. So today we are going to look at some of Nixon's domestic economic policies. Is the first slide. So we're looking at economics first. Nixon wanted to push more conservative policies, but because of the Democratic-controlled Congress, he was often those conservative policies he tried to push forward were often rejected. So he had to manipulate his conservative policies in order to be passed by the Democratic Congress. And one of these policies is this idea of new federalism. Another term for new federalism is revenue sharing. And the goal of this is to shift responsibility for social programs from the federal government to the state government. So if it is a program like welfare, Head Start for pre-K, all of those different federal government programs that had been put in place under the Great Society or even earlier, his goal was to take the responsibility of that from the federal government to the state government. Congress approved this and gave local governments $30 billion to enact some of these more local ideas, as opposed to having them in Washington, D.C. control the spending. Through the 1970s, we also see a form of economic recession in the 1970s known as stagflation. Stagflation refers to economic slowdown combined with high inflation. So economic slowdown means jobs aren't growing, more money isn't being made, but the cost of things start to increase. So you might see, it might be something as simple as loaves of bread go from being $3 to $3.50. Or gas was a big one in the 1970s where it's going from 25 cents back then to like suddenly 50 cents. It's a dramatic increase without the quality of the item going up. A way that Nixon combated this was through deficit spending. And while he was using deficit spending, it also increased his appeal to the middle class and blue collar workers because it showed that he was taking an interest in their priorities and what they deemed to be necessary. And because of his quick thinking through deficit spending, this recession actually ended by 1972. So it was a very quick turnaround. So while the early 1970s suffered from economic slowdown, he was able to combat that very quickly. One of the other things that Nixon is most popularly known for is his Southern strategy. So Nixon saw his results of the 1968 election and realized that in order to be reelected, he needed more public support. And so Nixon tried to create a Republican majority by appealing to the silent majority, which I know we've discussed a little bit. So Nixon is appealing to this silent majority who are Americans who are exhausted by anti-war protests, Black militants like the Black Panthers, integration, and counterculture. So all of the Americans that he felt were exhausted by these ideas, he started manipulating his policies to cater to these people. And these are the people that he refers to as the silent majority. Nixon also starts his Southern strategy. In his Southern strategy, he does not, in order to appeal to Southern populations, he did not support civil rights because he thought it would alienate his Southern white supporters. And he also asked federal courts to delay integration, and he nominated 2 Southern conservatives to the Supreme Court. He also allowed his vice president to attack war protests and the press. So while he may not have been vocal against the anti-war protests, he pushed for his vice president to be against these things. And by all of these different, through all of these different policies, he is able to get support from the Southern Democrats or the Southern Dixiecrats that were becoming very disillusioned with the Democratic Party as it shifted towards the policies of both Kennedys and Johnson. He is trying to appeal to those Southern Democrats that are tired of the Johnsons and the Kennedys, who are pushing for more equity amongst social classes and races. This leads us into Nixon's relationship with the Supreme Court. In Nixon's first term, he had the opportunity to name 4 new Supreme Court justices, which is a lot. And Nixon chose Warren Burger to be his chief justice. So Warren Burger becomes Nixon's chief justice at the Supreme Court. Burger is a moderate conservative, so this is a drastic departure from Earl Warren, who pushed for all of those social reforms of the 1960s. So Warren Burger, by being a moderate conservative, he is going to be less willing to involve the Supreme Court in different social changes. But despite this court being more moderate, we also see a change. They still do push some change. And one of these changes is they pass a new busing order, which requires more busing to be provided in cities, which is to help eliminate this racial imbalance in different public schools. The other most important ruling of this court is Roe versus Wade in 1972. In this court, they argued that states could not prevent a woman from getting an abortion. So before this, certain states might allow abortions while other states might not. So this Supreme Court order is saying that no state can stop a woman from getting an abortion because it violates her constitutional right to privacy. So this allows legal abortions throughout the United States. And while yes, we do see some safeguards put up and some limits put on that, this is the Supreme Court ruling that does allow a woman a right to control her own body. And from all of these economic successes and his role with the Supreme Court, this leads us to the election of 1972. And this is a clear sign that his Southern strategy was working. Nixon got 61% of the popular votes, and this is where we also see, if you can see this Sun Belt or these Southern states, This is where we see proof that his Southern strategy was working. By appealing to the Southern majority, the silent majority, and through his Southern strategy, this is where we see Nixon transition the suburbs and the Sun Belt from being Democratic to Republican in their voting patterns. So when you guys say, when does the Republican Party and the Democratic Party start to look like what we have now? Here you go. It's finally happened. Some other movements that are important to understand during the Nixon era, while he may not have been overly involved in them, is the continuation of the women's equality movement. We read through the feminine mystique, as well as the Equal Pay Act, that women during the 1960s and the creation of now are actively pushing for their equality. And this does not stop in the 1970s. So one of the most important pieces of legislation that is put in charge, is put up for vote, is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment passes through Congress, and it is similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, except there should be no discrimination based off of gender. Gender should not come into play when it comes into a woman's right to do anything. And while the ERA passes in Congress, it never gets the president's or the state's support. And so we still do not have an Equal Rights Amendment that establishes that women should not be discriminated against based off of their gender. And while, yes, we do have this tragedy of the ERA never truly passing, we also have a success in the passage of Title IX. Now, Title IX ends sexual discrimination in schools that receive federal funding, which means that this provides equal athletic opportunities for female students as well as male students. So this means that a female athlete cannot be discriminated against in a school that receives federal funding if based off of her gender. And while it's super important to acknowledge all of these successes and these goals of the women's movement, we're also going to slightly shift and look at the opposition. Many women did not support the ERA in the same way that when we looked at the 19th Amendment, many women did not vote. One of the most famous proponents of anti-ERA and the anti-feminist movement is a woman named Phyllis Schlafly. And Phyllis Schlafly got support from women who felt that their traditional roles of being a wife and a mother were being threatened by the federal government pushing forward these ideas. And so they make a huge political pivot where when we see women fighting for equal rights, they call themselves pro-women or pro-feminist, Phyllis Schlafly takes that language and manipulates it and says, if you are pro-female, then you are anti-family. So women that are against the ERA frame themselves as pro-family. Obviously, we can see that you can be both pro-female and pro-family, but that is not the way that Phyllis Schlafly works. There's a lot to talk about with her. So this is just really important to understand when we start looking at the feminist movement becoming politicized. Before the 1970s, being a feminist was not a partisan issue. You were either feminist or not feminist. And it really did not have anything to do with the political party that you joined. However, after Roe versus Wade and the attempt at passing the ERA, this is where we start to see pro-feminist propaganda coming from the Democrats and pro-family propaganda coming from Republicans. So this is when we start to see a partisan divide of women utilizing the feminist movement to base their political party. So opposition, if you guys want to talk more about that, I'd love to. I think studying Phyllis Schlafly is super weird and super awesome. So that is where we are going to lead off. Here is a sneak peek at your oral drill terms that are going to be in your Google Form quiz. Again, you are going to have this term and you are going to have to define it for me. Please make sure you are thorough with your explanation. Use whatever resources that you need, but you shouldn't be spending more than about 5 minutes on this. And remember, this is where you will be getting your participation points for the day, so be sure to take it seriously. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I look forward to seeing you guys in your Zoom call. As always, please join me if you have any questions at all. I will be on from 11:20 to noon, and I will be on again for office hours from 2:30 to 4. So please reach out if you have any questions. I will see you guys there.